All right, well, thanks for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. Today, I'm delighted to be here talking about my work on how fire and nutrients affect carbon cycling, and specifically in savanna ecosystems. So grassy biomes in general span an incredible spatial extent. They're estimated to cover about 20% of the land surface area, and they dominate in particular regions like Africa, which is often what we think of when we hear savanna. But they also cover a large amount of area in places like North America, where we have the oak savannas and the prairies in the Midwest, as well as the grasslands throughout Canada. Now, within this broad term of grassy biome, we have landscapes that can vary an incredible amount in their vegetation structure. On one end of the spectrum, you have areas that are completely dominated by grasses. Those are aptly named grasslands. But throughout much of the area, you have areas that are dominated by both grasses and trees. And this coexistence and co-occurrence of grasses and trees is what defines the savanna biome. And another defining characteristic of savannas is the high fire frequency. So this map here is a global map of fire frequency taken from the last 15 years of satellite data and processed by GFED. And what you can see is that it varies a tremendous amount across the globe, but I've pointed out a few key areas, and these are actually where the savannas are. And this results in savannas playing a key role in the global carbon cycle. And this is because when fire burns through a landscape, it combusts the carbon stored in the plant biomass and releases it to the Earth's atmosphere. When you add this up across the globe in all ecosystems and with all fires, you get an estimate of about 2 petagrams of carbon emitted each year. Well, what does 2 petagrams even mean? To place it in perspective, humans emit anywhere from 8 to 10 petagrams due to fossil fuel combustion and cement production. So this number is quite substantial for the global carbon cycle. And I've just highlighted a few areas here that are tropical savannas, and you can see that they contain some of the highest densities of carbon emissions each year. And so today I'm going to be focusing in on tropical savannas. And just to give you an idea for their spatial extent, they dominate areas in South America as well as Africa and Australia, and there's some small but substantial tracts in India. Now, savannas aren't always burning, and they can also represent a substantial carbon sink. And in this case, a remote sensing study looking at changes in plant carbon since the 1990s focused in on 2 savanna areas in southern Africa and northern Australia. And they found, number one, that there's substantial fluctuations of carbon, but that a large amount of carbon can be sequestered, so increasing, when conditions are favorable to plant growth, in this case, determined through normalized rainfall. Now, whether or not savannas will continue to store carbon is uncertain in the future, given that fire regimes are projected to change across most of the globe. This here is a model output looking at the probability that fire frequency will either increase in the red colors or decrease in the cool colors. And what you can see here from these tropical savannas is there's an incredible amount of heterogeneity, with areas potentially decreasing in fire but also increasing. And so this really requires us to understand both the effects of increases in fire as well as decreases. And so all of these...
Sorry, 1 second, because the audio's not coming through. 1 second.
Oh, sorry. All right. Well, although those studies have taught us a lot about the effect of savannas on the global carbon cycle, there's a problem in the sense that they all focus on above-ground plant biomass. And this is an issue because the majority of carbon in a savanna ecosystem is actually stored below ground in the soils and plant roots. And consequently, the effect of changes in things like fire and precipitation on the amount of carbon in an ecosystem at the whole scale is largely uncertain. And just to give you an idea, here's an estimate of the amount of carbon stored in savanna soils to be about 30% of total soil carbon in the tropics. So it's obvious that understanding whether or not savannas store or lose carbon is important for understanding the global carbon cycle. But this question is quite complicated because of the number of factors involved, as well as the issue of linking changes in plants with shifts in soils. So first I want to think about what determines how much carbon a savanna even stores. Well, as I mentioned before, carbon is stored primarily in two main pools, the plants and the soils. But these pools aren't independent. As turnover in plant biomass through growth and dropping their leaves and dying, those carbon and nutrients can be decomposed and enter into the soil pools. Now, soils can also influence plants, as the turnover and mineralization of nutrients can lead to increases in plant growth rates. Now, fire and other disturbances can alter the amount of carbon and nutrients in a savanna, both by directly shifting the amount in the plant pool, but also indirectly in the soils as it combusts plant biomass before it has the chance to turn over. So this conceptual diagram leads to a nice hypothesis that the carbon balance is a function of the interaction between these losses due to fire, resources available for plants to regrow, and then the response of both plants and soils. And so let's see what the evidence is for this hypothesis. Well, the effect of fire on vegetation is relatively straightforward. Immediately, fire combusts a large amount of the plant biomass in the landscape. Over longer timescales, it leads to changes in woody plant biomass, and that's what this figure is showing. So this is a paper that looked at the effect of 4 decades of different fire regimes, with the black bars being areas where fire was excluded. And you can see that in areas where fire was excluded, there's substantial amounts of increases in woody plant biomass. Now, the effect of fire on below ground pools is far less intuitive and straightforward. In some cases, you have studies also that have been going on for about 40 years where they found no significant effect of fire on carbon storage below ground. But then you look at a different study, and it's just been going for 13 years, and there is a significant effect, although small, still significant, on soil carbon, with increased burning resulting in decreased soil carbon. So there are a number of factors that can be leading to the differences between these two studies, but it's clear that we need a better understanding of the mechanisms for these below-ground changes to reconcile some differences. So now let's think about resources available for recovery, and specifically about nutrients. Nutrients are hypothesized to increase carbon through increasing plant growth rates, but most of our studies on the effect of nutrients on carbon in savannas come in this form, where there's correlations between soil nutrients and the amount of woody plant biomass there. But it's impossible in this study to separate out correlation from causation because of the potential for woody plant biomass to turn over and influence the soil pools. And then finally, we need to think about the interaction between fire and nutrients. A study that actually quantified all the nitrogen in vegetation by destructively harvesting it and then burning the landscape found that fire volatilized about 45% of all the above ground biomass nitrogen in a single event. But whether or not this leads to long-term changes is unclear. So we can go back to our original hypothesis and see that some of the key uncertainties lie in this interaction term and then in the coupled responses of plants and soils. So today I'm going to dig into that using 3 main questions. The first is just a simple question of how fire changes carbon in an ecosystem, and then thinking about whether or not it alters nutrients and how these changes in nutrients affect plants. And then finally, I'm going to end with discussing why we might see variability in the effect of fire across ecosystems. So let's dive into fire and carbon. Well, I'm going to break this down into 2 sub-questions. First, quantifying the effect of fire on carbon, and then thinking about exactly the mechanism determining the effect of fire on soil carbon. And to do so, I went to Kruger National Park. Kruger is located in northeastern South Africa, and it contains this incredible experimental manipulation where they've been manipulating the fire frequency of plots about 7 hectares in size since the 1950s. And these plots are replicated at a number of regions throughout the park. I'm focusing in on a central region, and they're replicated multiple times at the landscape scale. And within each replicate, there are about 12 different fire treatments. Today, I'm going to be going through 3 in particular. Plots that are unburned, so they've been protected from since the 50s. Plots that have been burned every year, and then plots that have been burned every 3 years. And this triennial fire treatment is significant because it's thought to represent the natural baseline and serve as a control. So when I quantified the amount of carbon in the soils and the plants, what we found was that fire significantly depleted the amount of carbon in the ecosystem. So it changed the amount of carbon in the plant biomass, which is what we expected, but it also led to significant shifts in the soils. And just to orient you, left to right is decreasing fire. So what we found is the soils in the unburned plots had actually about a quarter more carbon than those in the annually burned plots. And even though trees represented the largest relative change, the largest absolute change was in the soil pools, with a shift in about 10 megagrams of carbon in soils and only 2 in trees. So the axes are separated and differ by an order of magnitude. Now, grasses proved to be more resilient than trees. As you see, there's no significant difference in the biomass in grasses in the triennial plots from the unburned plots. So with soils driving the largest changes in the ecosystem, we wanted to understand what was causing the changes in soil pools. And to do so, we measured soil carbon isotopes. And the reason why you can use isotopes to figure out the contribution of soil is because contribution of grass is because grasses have the C4 photosynthetic pathway, which fractionates carbon in a particular way, whereas trees and woody shrubs have the C3 pathway. I'm not going to go into the physiologies behind why these pathways fractionate differently, but what you can do is basically put in these 2 different end members and calculate the isotope in the soil and see how much carbon is derived from grass. And in this case, we found that about 70% of the carbon in the soil was from grass. And it tended to increase with increasing frequency in fire. And so from that, we can go back to this initial question and conclude that we found that fire significantly affected carbon in the ecosystem, with the largest changes actually occurring in below-ground pools. And interestingly enough, these changes in below-ground pools occurred through the turnover of grass biomass and not necessarily shifts in woody cover. But these results just come from a single savanna and a dry one at that. So let's think about whether or not there are any consistent effects across different savannas. And to do so, I crossed the Atlantic and went to the Brazilian savannas. And so the savannas here are incredibly wet. And an area that I sampled has about 3 times as much precipitation as the savanna that I previously showed you data on, making it one of the wetter savannas in the world. And in Brazil, my study design was slightly different in the sense that I sampled a gradient due to fire history, not due to experimental manipulation per se, but due to a time since fire was excluded. And this is a reserve that burned every 3 to 5 years up until around the 50s, when managers decided to exclude fire from particular areas for one reason or another. And we were able to get this nice gradient of time since fire exclusion. And the really important thing is that the soil types and the underlying hydrology and water table depth are all the same across these plots. So any change that we see in the soil is likely due to changes in fire. And what we found was that, once again, there was a strong, significant response of the vegetation, with woody plants increasing substantially with number of years since fire. And grasses actually declined in biomass over time, and that's because woody plants were achieving such high densities that they were shading out the grasses. And similarly, we can look to soil carbon, and here I've just split it up into 2 different pools to see if there's a difference with depth, and there's not. And we found also a significant effect of fire on soil carbon, with the most fire-protected plots containing about 50% more carbon than those most exposed. And we also observed this substantial accumulation in a litter layer. And that's relatively intuitive, but it's nice because it's showing us that when you remove fire, you're allowing for the accumulation of above-ground plant biomass that can decompose and enter into the soils. Now, when we begin to look at changes in the total ecosystem pools, we start to see some differences between Brazil and Africa. And what you're looking at here is just a plot of the total carbon stock across the sites, and then broken down into these different pools. And what we found was that although soils continued to be the dominant storage pool of carbon in the landscape, the changes in total carbon were about equal in soils as well as woody plants. So in this case, woody plants contributed about 50% to the changes in soil carbon, which is a stark contrast to Africa, where they only contributed 15%. And then similarly, we can turn to carbon isotopes again. And here's just South Africa on average for reference. And what we found was that the isotopes were significantly more depleted in Brazil, with the isotopic signature approaching what we would expect from a tree tissue with increased time since fire. So this is telling us two important things. The first is that trees are the dominant source to soil carbon, even in these open savannas, and that their contribution to soil carbon increases as you exclude fire. So the turnover and inputs from trees are replacing the losses from grass. So we can go back to the last part of this first question and conclude that the effect of fire on ecosystem carbon was consistent across these savannas in the sense that both plants and soils responded, but there were some fundamental differences in the relative contribution of woody plants versus soils to changes in the total ecosystem. And this is likely driven by the fact that when you have greater precipitation, you have the greater potential for woody plant cover, and so we captured those effects. All right, so now I want to move into the second part of the talk, thinking about how fire changes nutrient pools and whether or not these changes affect plants. Just as a bit of a background, nutrients in fire are hypothesized to be a coupled system in savannas, where you have fire volatilizing nutrients stored in plant biomass in a similar process to how it volatilizes carbon. And what that does is it restricts the ability of those nutrients to turn over into the soil. And then what you get is a decline in soil fertility, restricting the performance of the plants over time. So this feedback loop is often proposed, but it's actually not really well tested in savannas. And today I want to go through and try to test it using three main questions. First, thinking about whether or not fire even alters nutrients in soils primarily, how it induces a shift in the nutrient status of individuals, and then thinking about whether or not it's filtering the plant community. So first I want to dig into our work in Africa. And the nutrients that I focused on are primarily nitrogen and phosphorus because those are hypothesized to be the main limiting nutrients to plant growth in tropical savanna ecosystems. And what we found when we looked at nitrogen was a very similar story to carbon. Once again, there was a depletion in the plant pools, makes sense, but we also found a significant effect in the soil pools, with the unburned plots actually containing about 60% more nitrogen than the annually burned plots. So it seems like fire is depleting nitrogen from the ecosystem. When we look at phosphorus, however, we see a different story, where there's actually no significant effect of fire on total phosphorus in the ecosystem. And you're looking at plants, and you see, well, there's also a significant effect on the change in plant biomass phosphorus, but when you look at soils, there's actually a slight tendency for an increase with more frequent fire. And this increase is swamping out any sort of depletion in the plant pools. And so this makes intuitive sense because phosphorus doesn't have a gaseous form. It doesn't get volatilized and lost to the atmosphere. It's hypothesized to be lost through wind transport of ash or more likely due to leaching after it's been redeposited. And we don't find evidence for losses. We just find evidence that it's actually just being redistributed from the plant pool into the soils. So that was kind of interesting. Now we can go back to South American savannas to see if the results are consistent. And when we look at nitrogen, we also found a similar story where the nitrogen in the most fire-protected plots were about 70% higher than those in the most exposed to fire. And then we can also look at inorganic nitrogen. And so the inorganic nitrogen is significant because it's thought to represent the form of nitrogen that's available for plant uptake. So plants can only take up relatively simple forms of nitrogen, either very simple organics or inorganics. And what we're seeing here is that there's a 150% increase in the amount of inorganic nitrogen. And this is nice because it's telling us that the changes in total nitrogen are responsible for the corresponding changes in available nitrogen. Now, when we look at phosphorus, we see an interesting story and one that's different from what we observed in Africa. And this is just phosphorus concentration here because it was interesting that we saw an increase in the phosphorus concentration in the litter, but we also saw an accumulation of phosphorus in the soil when you protect the system from fire. And so this here is showing us that fire is actually a lost pathway for phosphorus. And I would be happy to discuss some of the mechanisms that we're digging into now after the talk, but I don't have time to go into it. And from these two studies, we can conclude that the effect of fire on the amount of nitrogen in the ecosystem was relatively consistent between Brazil and South Africa in the sense that it was depleted by fire. Phosphorus was more mixed. And so what these results suggest is that fire is likely driving nitrogen limitation, albeit with phosphorus changes may also be shifting phosphorus limitation. And so given these changes in the nutrients in the soils, do we see a shift in the nutrient status of individual plants? And I'm going to be presenting data on tissue stoichiometry. And so all that means is the concentration of nutrients in plant tissues. And the reason why I'm presenting data on that is because the concentration of nutrients in plant tissues is thought to be related to a number of key physiological processes, like photosynthesis is highly related to nitrogen content in the leaves. You also have nitrogen in the roots that's related to root growth rates and nitrogen uptake. And I want to test whether or not fire is shifting the stoichiometry of species. And first, I'll show data from South Africa, where we sampled the leaves, so F for foliage, and roots of 8 different woody plant species, as well as total grass community. And we are looking at their tissue nitrogen concentration between the unburned and the annually burned plots. And you can see that there's a substantial amount of variability across species and tissue forms, but there's absolutely zero significant effect of fire on the concentration of nutrients in plant tissues. And we also did this for phosphorus concentrations, nitrogen to phosphorus, carbon and nitrogen, anything that you could imagine, and there was zero effect of fire on the stoichiometry of these plants. Now when we go to South America, we find a very similar story where I measured fewer woody plant species, but we found that there was no significant difference in the concentration of nitrogen in the leaves of plants that are in the most fire-protected plots versus those most recently burned. And you can see, well, maybe there's a slight increase across these species, and that could be the case, but the variability was just too substantial to detect any sort of a significant effect. And so going back to the original question, we found that at least in the variable that we measured, stoichiometry, there's no evidence for fire changing the nutrient status of individuals. And there are obviously a number of other variables that can be measured looking at individual nutrient status. But stoichiometry is significant because it's also been measured in a number of other systems that have been exposed to fire. And in temperate savannas, they find a strong effect of fire-driven nitrogen losses on tissue stoichiometry of plants, with plants in more frequently burned areas having lower nitrogen concentrations. And also in recovering tropical forests, where the very nitrogen-poor recovering tropical forests also see a shift in stoichiometry as nitrogen becomes less limiting. So this raises some cool questions, I think, about why stoichiometry is homeostatic in tropical savannas. And now I want to go into whether or not fire shifts plant communities towards those better adapted to low nutrient conditions. So first, let's think a little bit about what it means to be adapted to low nutrient conditions. Well, generally, plants tend to have long-lived leaves. Leaves are very expensive to produce from a nutrient standpoint. And every time you shed a leaf, you can only get so much of that nutrient from the leaf back into the plant, and it costs carbon. So plants generally living in low nutrient conditions try to get a high return on investment. They also tend to have lower foliar biomass and lower nutrient concentrations in the leaves, and then they correspondingly have slower growth rates. And today I'm going to be focusing on nitrogen, and to evaluate whether fire is selecting for species better adapted to low nutrient conditions, I'm going to be looking in Brazil, where we took advantage of the fact that when you manipulate fire, you see a complete transition from a biome from savanna into forest. And along this transition, you see this stark nitrogen gradient, where we observed 150% change in the inorganic nitrogen. And so rather than actually go and measure the traits on all the species and all the communities of all of our plots, what we did was we categorized the most abundant species across our plots into being primarily associated with either the forest habitat or the savanna habitat. And so assuming that fire is the key delineator between these habitats, which we found, as well as a number of other studies have found, we can compare the traits of those functional guilds to get an idea for how fire is filtering species according to their nutrient use strategies. And so first, let's think about leaf lifespan. So here what I'm showing is this variable specific leaf area, and that's basically telling you how thin or thick a leaf is. And specific leaf area is highly significantly related to leaf lifespan, where thicker leaves tend to live longer. And what we found was that savanna species tended to have thicker leaves than forest species. So this is what we would expect if savanna species were to be adapted to low nutrient conditions. And we can also look at the amount of nutrients in the live leaves, where we find savanna species have lower nitrogen concentrations in their live leaves. And they also have lower nitrogen concentrations in their senesced leaves. So these are on different axes. And this is significant because it's showing that savanna species are taking more of that nitrogen back before they're dropping their leaf. And what I did was I added in these different differences, as well as the differences in the growth rates of the two guilds and their foliar biomass, into just a very, very simple vegetation model. And you can see when you grow these species from scratch, you can quantify the amount of nitrogen in an individual and look at the forest species, and you see that they always contain more nitrogen and that they're demanding it at much greater rates than a savanna species. And so we can go back to our original question and conclude that it seems that fire is filtering the plant community towards species better adapted to low nutrient conditions. And so combining these results with the previous study on carbon, we're beginning to see a story where carbon and nitrogen are relatively coupled in savannas. And even though we're seeing large nutrient losses, it's relatively mixed in how the communities are responding. And so now I want to go into the final section of my talk that focuses in on how plant communities can modify the response of ecosystems to fire. And to do so, I want to think about individual trees in the ecosystem. And the reason for that is because the response of an ecosystem is often the integrated response of all the individual trees in that ecosystem. And just to show this in a diagram, if you think about fire burning through a savanna or a forest, you could imagine three outcomes. A tree could completely survive that fire, it could be completely killed, or it could just be top killed, where it loses its above ground biomass but can resprout. So this is what oaks do, for example. And you can imagine that depending on the outcome of fire at each individual tree, this can have, whichever pathway it takes, can have massive implications for the effect of fire on carbon storage in the ecosystem. And so understanding the vulnerability of trees in the ecosystem is really important for predicting the effect of fire on carbon. But it remains a challenge, and this challenge is a real pressing one given that fire regimes are projected to change in the tropics. So what I'm showing you here is model output for the end of this century, the projected fire frequency, rescaled to the current fire frequency. And all of these warm colors are areas where fire is expected to increase in frequency. Two important things. Number one, it's covering the majority of tropical South America. And number two, it's occurring in areas both within the savanna region as well as in the majority of areas like the Amazon forest. And so now I'm going to begin to scale past just thinking about savannas and also thinking about tropical forests. In order to determine how the effect of fire may differ across plant communities, I want to start with this broad comparison between a savanna community and a forest community. And to do so, I want to identify how plant functional traits may structure their vulnerability. And this is because traits can give you some insight into the physiological mechanisms behind how fire kills a tree. And one important plant trait for determining the effect of fire on a tree is relative bark thickness. And the reason for that is because when fire burns through a landscape, what bark does is it insulates the inside of the stem. So the inside of the stem basically dies when it hits 60 degrees Celsius. And what bark does is it buffers that temperature increase. So generally, when you have thicker bark on a tree, you tend to have a lower probability of stem biomass loss in a fire. There's obviously a lot of other factors that can play a role in determining biomass losses. And we've looked across a number of ecosystems, and we see this strong negative relationship. The shape differs, sure, but importantly, in all cases, bark thickness explains the majority of variance in the probability of top kill. But absolute bark thickness, which is what determines the probability that fire kills a tree, is a function of both the size of the stem as well as the amount that the species is investing in its bark. And this is what the trait is, relative bark thickness. So here's an example from 6 different genera in the neotropics, 2 species within each genus, and their bark accumulation curves. And there are 2 things to note. The first is that the curves differ significantly from one another. And the second is that these curves are significant, showing that species are consistently investing similar amounts in their bark. And so I wanted to use bark thickness as a proxy for vulnerability to fire when I'm looking across savannas and forests. And here I'll be focusing in on Brazil again, where we compiled a data set of 180 plots distributed across savannas and forests. And in each of these plots, we have the species compositions, we have the sizes of the stems. And after we knew what species were there, we took the most abundant species and we went out and measured their bark investment on, it was a couple hundred species. And then by doing some other classifications and assumptions about barkilometries, we characterized the bark thickness of all the individual trees. And what we found was that, on average, stems tended to be larger in forests than they were in savannas. This is not necessarily a surprise. You walk into a forest, there are big trees there. But the absolute bark thickness of a tree was significantly greater in savanna. And so what this is telling us is that the species that occur in savanna are investing so much in bark that they're overcoming for their smaller stem diameters. So how does this translate into the fire sensitivity of these carbon pools? Well, we can go back to this statistical relationship between bark thickness and the probability that a stem loses its above ground biomass. And here, these are Brazilian forests and savanna taken from about 8,000 individuals that we measured whether or not they lost their above ground biomass in a fire. And we can apply that to each individual stem in our data set based on the absolute bark thickness of that stem. And what we found when you weight that by the amount of biomass of that stem was that forests had significantly greater proportion of its biomass carbon that can be lost in a fire, on the order of about 30% in a single fire event. And when you add this in with the differences in biomass, you have forests losing potentially twice as much carbon as a savanna. And so this may make intuitive sense, but in the studies that I cited before in my introduction that estimate that 2 petagrams of carbon lost, they actually assume the opposite of what this graph shows, where they're assuming there's a greater amount of biomass loss coming from savannas than forests. So this raises some issues. And for sure, right now this is just a scaling exercise. We're using these statistical extrapolations, but we went out and we validated our estimate on 70 fires in savannas and forests, and we found that our scaling approach was able to significantly reproduce the observed data. But what I've shown you now is I've just been thinking about these things as savannas or forests. And obviously, savannas and forests can differ substantially in the climates that they occur in the communities that they have. And so we wanted to get some idea for how environmental conditions may affect the vulnerability to fire, and specifically testing this long-standing hypothesis that wet tropical forests are very vulnerable to fire. So we can perform these calculations across plots and look at them as a function of the mean annual precipitation. And what we found is that the amount of carbon in a plot in a forest significantly increases with precipitation. This is no surprise. Wetter forests can store more carbon. But the carbon losses also increased, such that wetter forests can also lose more carbon. Now, when we look at savannas, we see a different story, where the wetter savannas store slightly more carbon, not all too much, but there's no significant change in the carbon losses. And so the carbon there is proportionately more stable. And so what's going on here? There's something changing. There's either a shift in maybe the stem size across these forests and savannas, or perhaps community composition. So what we did was we dug into what was driving species investment in bark. And to do so, I've shown you this graph here where each dot is a species, and then we've characterized the climate. We've determined the climate that characterizes its distribution using available distribution data sets. And you can see here that the bark investment, so this is bark thickness per stem diameter, of a forest species tends to decrease with increasing precipitation. So these wetter forest species are investing less in bark, likely due to the fact that these wet forests didn't really burn historically. Savannas, we see the exact opposite pattern. And that's likely due to the case that in these wetter savannas, you tend to have more grass biomass. They still have a dry season, and so they really go up in flames when they burn. And the really interesting thing here is that we're seeing this shift in species strategies that's then turning over in the community that's resulting in our estimates of vulnerability to fire changing. So going back to our original question, we can conclude that the variability in traits and their fire tolerance across these communities can differ substantially, and from our approach, bark thickness can be one window into determining this vulnerability. And here we've approached it from this relatively simple scaling exercise. And one thing that I've also been working on over the last year is developing a dynamic vegetation model that works relatively well for neotropical savannas and forests in collaboration with some other people at Princeton. And I'd be happy to talk about that. But we're really hoping to use that to truly quantify actual carbon fluxes from these systems. So with that, I want to go back to our original question of what determines the carbon balance of a savanna ecosystem. And well, we found that fire significantly affected carbon storage, as expected in the plants, but it also drove large changes in soils to such an extent that in the drier savannas, changes in soils were the largest pool that were shifting in the ecosystem. And we found that grasses in the drier savannas played the larger role in determining changes in soil carbon, whereas trees in the wetter savannas played a larger role. And then when we looked at nutrients, we found evidence that fire was a large nutrient loss pathway, especially for nitrogen. The jury on phosphorus is still out, but like I said, ask me after. We have some interesting data on that. And when we look at changes in community composition, we see some evidence that species in the savanna show indications that they're adapted to these low nutrient conditions. And then finally, when we looked at the community composition across the plots, we gained some insight into how the vulnerability of savannas and forests broadly, as well as within a savanna and forest across climates, may differ to fire. So with that, I just want to discuss very briefly an ongoing project that I'm doing that I'm really excited about that's taking up the majority of my time. And that's trying to understand how fire and nutrients interact to affect carbon in savannas and forests, and then using traits to predict their effects. And so I want to really develop a framework for trying to predict the response of tropical forests in savannas to fire. And to do so, I'm going to be thinking again about plant traits. So imagine that you have some plants with these suites of traits, like a savanna tree. They have high fire tolerance because they invest a lot in bark. They tend to grow slowly, and they have lower nutrient concentrations. And then forest trees can be seen as the opposite. And so the question is, can these different strategies give us insight not only into how well a community can resist consumption by fire, but also respond after a fire event? So looking at both resistance and resilience. And to do so, I've set up this large experimental manipulation in savannas and forests in Brazil. This is just one replicate here, so this is in the middle of the Sao Paulo state, in case anyone's interested. And what we have are paired savannas as well as forests that were either protecting from fire or were burning every year. And so the first burns were this August. I'm really looking forward to going back and see what went up in flames. And in each of these plots, we've also nested a fertilization experiment. And so we're testing some of the questions that my previous work raised about, is nitrogen really limiting? What about phosphorus? And in each of these plots, we're measuring things like the response of trees and their growth rates, looking at their traits that may be determining the responses, as well as some general biogeochemical variables like soil carbon turnover and mineralization. And ultimately, the goal of this, as I alluded to earlier, is to roll this into a dynamic vegetation model. And right now we're working with this ED2 model, ecosystem demography. And really the important thing about this model is that it captures individual stem dynamics. And this is critical because that is the level that fire is operating on. You can't assume that biomass is just in one big stem when you're trying to model the effect of fire. So that's called a big leaf model. Those are bad for this system. And so we're adapting the fire module using the data from Brazil. We're also adding in nutrient cycling and rolling in some important plant traits. So we hope that this will allow us to really scale up our findings at the regional level to understand what is the effect of fire now on carbon cycling and what will it be under changes in fire regimes. And I was really pleased to see the work that was being done at the biological station. And for those of you that don't know, and sorry for the redundancy for those of you that do know, there's an incredible fire experiment going on there that's actually very similar to the one that I've been running in Brazil. And although there are a number of variables that are being measured there, I think some can just make for basic contrast between their results and my results. But there are a few things that I'd really like to be able to do there that I think represents a prime location. And the first is thinking about the details behind changes in soil carbon. So in this talk, I talked about carbon just in terms of C, just its element. But carbon can come in all different shapes and sizes. And there's one hypothesis that fire may result in the losses of total carbon, but the carbon that remains is actually more stable. And so you could see this shift of the differences in the carbon in the soil moving from one that is more susceptible to being lost due to respiration to one that's more stable through time. And then thinking about how fire, plant, soil nutrient feedbacks emerge, being able to do something a lot closer to home would be a lot nicer and allow for more detailed measurements. So today I've talked about my work that's looked on tropical savannas primarily and a little bit about my work on tropical forests. And really the plan that I have for moving forward isn't necessarily focusing in on a particular ecosystem or a particular process, but I think there are a few really important questions in ecosystem ecology right now that are very relevant to global change. The first is trying to understand the long-term effect of disturbance on an ecosystem. And so not just what happens after you burn a savanna once or after one drought hits a US forest, but how will these results accumulate over time? And then second, thinking about resources limiting the recovery from disturbance, as well as interacting dynamically with disturbances. Fire isn't the only disturbance where nutrients can be lost during it. And then, of course, it's always nice to place the work in the perspective of trying to improve our ability to predict the future. All of these dynamic global vegetation models are making a ton of progress in being able to predict the Earth's climate at the end of the century. And I think it's really important to keep that in the back of our mind and trying to push those forward, even when we're doing completely empirical work. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody that's helped me. Just a shout out especially to the people helping me with the vegetation models that are running it on their servers, South Africa, Brazil, and then Steve for helping out with my theory. And thank you. Time for questions.
We've got about 10 minutes for questions, so I'll let Adam do his own.
That convincing. Oh, yeah.
So I was wondering, one of the things I had been wondering is if you simply burn a lot of, so you said that the difference between savanna and forest, a lot of that is driven by the frequency of fire.
Yes.
And so your new experiment that you talked about will give some insight into if you burn things more, what happens to them.
Mm-hmm.
But I was wondering if part of, so you mentioned that there are the predictions that fire should increase a lot. And I was wondering why it's increasing a lot.
Yeah.
Are there other things changing with it that might alter the predictions you would expect, that, like from what you can predict from your experiment? Hopefully that makes sense.
From what I can predict.
Like, so if you do this experiment where you burn things, is that burning them in a way that would happen in the way it's predicted from these increases?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the first question, which was what's driving changes in fire? A number of things. in areas that are developing, generally increases in human population density tend to be positively related with fire. But this is a nonlinear relationship where once areas become more developed, human populations suppress fire. So that's one thing that's changing fire across the globe. Probably the biggest driver and the one that's most well understood is the effect of climate change. And so a classical example is from US forests, where the earlier spring snowmelt results in drier forests and greater frequency of fires. Now in savannas, it's a similar thing, where when you have very, very severe droughts, then you get the trees are dropping their leaves, the grass is all dying, and things can really increase in their fire. So that's one hypothesis behind how changes in fire will roll out. As far as whether or not our experiment captures these potential changes, yes, in the sense that all of these increases in fire happen from an ignition event. No, in the sense that the changes in fire due to anthropogenic ignitions are generally associated with things like cows being really close to the savanna because it's pasture, and atmospheric deposition of nutrients because it's by pastures and things like that. So sort of a yes and no. Definitely take it with a grain of salt when you're trying to extrapolate it to the globe. Yeah. Yes.
So, when you talk about the changes with fire frequency, both or time since the last fire, kind of treat it as a straight successional system, but I also tend to think in some recent work of savannas as alternative stable
Yeah.
states, so much more abrupt shifts. So how does that fit into the way you're thinking about it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So for those of you that don't know, there's this hypothesis that savannas and forests are alternative stable states where you have areas that are savannas that could become forests because of the climates, but they don't because they burn. And vice versa with forests, but because forests don't burn. So if I understand your question correctly, it's why do we see this gradual change? Well, it's because we've excluded fire. And so the alternative stable state theory requires fire to be there for there to be an alternative state. And so the stabilizing factor behind a savanna in their alternative stable state theory is that when you have grass, it burns. And that's how you maintain savanna and limit woody plant encroachment. But what we're doing in these plots where fire is excluded is we're basically removing that positive feedback that is necessary for the stability of the savanna. Does that make sense? So before humans excluded fire from this landscape, there was far fewer forest, and the savannas tended to burn naturally every 3 to 5 years, and the forests that were just there because of other historical factors tended to not burn. And so they were stable over on those timescales, but then humans just stopped fire in a lot of savannas.
But I guess the part I'm thinking about is that there's also some hysteresis in terms of between the rate at which you move from between states, and maybe that's where I'm having a little trouble fitting that in with this. I haven't thought
I
it
see.
through. I'm just trying to get my head around these two different approaches to it.
Yeah, so touching on the hysteresis, I think that is a really, really cool question. And what I showed you data on was a savanna transitioning into forest, and nutrients were behaving in that way. But the flip side is a forest transitioning into savannas. And you could expect the intercept of the nutrients starting very high and perhaps the changing, its change on a different slope because you're starting out with a greater amount of nutrients. And so if you go to a site that looks to you that it's savanna, well, it could have very different nutrients depending on whether or not it came from a forest or came from a savanna. So the direction that you're going and where you came from is definitely important. And that's one thing that's nested into that NOAA field experiment is we're burning savannas and forests and fertilizing them because we have some hypotheses about how the different state of the ecosystem may determine their relative responses. But yeah, great question.
Time for one more. Hannah, did you have a question?
So I was wondering about some of the like remote sensing products with Modus Fire data, for example, and right?
Mhm.
The rest of southern Africa, if those products can be used to think about nutrient availability in that context. And then the other component of that is everything was casted in the frequency realm and not the intensity.
Mhm.
And so that was the other piece of the story that I wanted to know.
Yeah, okay, both of them excellent questions. Can I start with the intensity because it's simpler? So one reason why we focused on frequency is just due to the practical availability. There's only a few fire experiments that manipulate intensity. However, what intensity does is it can change the combustion dynamics by resulting in hotter fires, which can combust and volatilize more elements. So carbon and nitrogen, I think, get volatilized at around like 300 to 500 degrees Celsius. Other elements require way, way hotter fires. So intensity can definitely change nutrient loss dynamics, and it can also change regrowth. But yeah, we just didn't focus on that. But it's definitely really important, especially in ecosystems where intensity is expected to go up. Now, for Modus fire products, being applicable to places like Southern Africa, you really need to have a good idea of what you're trying to measure, in the sense, are you looking at the effect of fire on an area that's pasture? And so then you'd need a land mask to see how that would affect the soil fertility. If you're looking at a natural savanna, then you would be starting from a completely different state. So I think you could definitely use Modus to make inferences about potential effects of increased fire. But in order to put a quantitative number on how the nutrients are changing, you need to know its starting state. And in places like woodlands, your detectability of fire from space decreases because it, gets blocked out by the trees. But yeah, that's another great question.
Well, let's find out what